The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen walked into the crowded mess hall at Naval Base Coronado. The familiar smell of industrial-grade coffee and reheated lasagna filled the air. She had just finished a grueling 14-hour training session with her SEAL team, and all she wanted was a quiet meal and maybe 10 minutes to decompress before the next briefing. Sarah was small in stature, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a lean build that most people mistook for fragility. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and without her gear, she looked more like a college student than one of the Navy's most elite operators. This misperception had followed her throughout her 8-year military career, but she had learned to use it to her advantage. She grabbed a tray and moved through the serving line, nodding politely to the kitchen staff who knew her well. The mess hall was busier than usual, filled with new recruits who had just arrived for their initial training phases. Their fresh faces and nervous energy reminded Sarah of her own early days in the Navy, though her path had taken a very different direction than most of these young sailors would ever imagine. Finding an empty table in the corner, Sarah set down her tray and pulled out her phone to review some mission notes. The pasta looked edible enough, and the salad was actually fresh for once. She took a few bites while scrolling through encrypted messages from her team leader about tomorrow's water insertion training. The noise level in the mess hall was typical for evening chow time. Conversations mixing with the clatter of trays and utensils. The occasional burst of laughter from groups of friends. Sarah had learned to tune it out, finding small pockets of peace even in crowded spaces. It was a skill that had served her well during countless deployments and covert operations. 3 tables over, a group of new recruits were engaged in the kind of boisterous conversation that marked them as fresh out of boot camp. They were discussing their upcoming assignments, each trying to impress the others with their knowledge of military operations gleaned from movies and video games. Their voices carried easily across the mess hall. "I heard they're looking for volunteers for special operations training," said Jake Morrison, a tall recruit from Texas with the kind of swagger that usually got beaten out of new sailors within their first month. "I'm definitely going to apply. I mean, how hard can it be?" His friend Danny Rodriguez rolled his eyes. "Dude, you barely made it through the physical fitness test. Special ops is like insane level stuff. Navy SEALs, and all that." The third member of their group, Kevin Walsh, leaned forward conspiratorially. "My cousin knows a guy who tried out for SEAL training. Said it was the hardest thing he ever did in his life. Only like 10% of people who start actually finish." Jake scoffed. "Yeah, well, most people don't have what it takes. You've got to be tough. You know? Like, mentally and physically superior. It's not for everyone." Sarah couldn't help but overhear their conversation. She had heard variations of this discussion countless times over the years, usually from young recruits who had no real understanding of what special operations actually entailed. The movies and media had created this mythology around SEALs that bore little resemblance to the reality of the job. The reality was less about being superior and more about being adaptable, resilient, and able to work as part of a team under impossible circumstances. It was about making split-second decisions when lives depended on it. About maintaining your humanity while doing things that most people couldn't imagine, and about sacrificing personal comfort for something larger than yourself. But Sarah also remembered being young and full of misconceptions about military life. These recruits would learn, just as she had. The military had a way of teaching humility to everyone, regardless of how tough they thought they were going in. She continued eating, trying to focus on her mission notes, when she noticed the conversation at the recruits' table had shifted. Danny was pointing in her direction, and all 3 young men were looking at her with expressions that made her stomach tighten with familiarity. "Check out the cute girl over there," Danny said, lowering his voice, but not nearly enough. "Think she's Navy too? She looks pretty young." Jake turned to look at Sarah, his eyes scanning her in a way that made her jaw clench. "Maybe we should go introduce ourselves," Kevin suggested with a grin that Sarah recognized immediately. She had seen that look many times before. The predatory confidence of young men who thought they had found easy prey. Sarah set down her fork and took a slow breath. She could feel the familiar tension building in her shoulders, the same feeling she got before a mission, when everything hung in the balance. But this wasn't enemy territory. This was her own mess hall, where she should be able to eat in peace. The three recruits were still talking, their voices getting louder as they fed off each other's energy. Other sailors at nearby tables were starting to notice, some glancing between the recruits and Sarah with knowing looks. The dynamics were all too familiar to anyone who had spent time in the military. "Come on," Jake said, standing up and straightening his uniform. "Let's go be friendly. Welcome her to the base." Danny and Kevin exchanged glances but followed Jake's lead, rising from their seats. Sarah watched them approach through her peripheral vision while pretending to read her phone. She could predict exactly how this was going to go. The false friendliness. The casual questions designed to assess her status and vulnerability. The gradual escalation if she didn't respond the way they wanted. Her hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where her military ID was stored. The ID that would immediately end this situation, if she chose to use it. But something held her back. Maybe it was curiosity about how far they would push it. Or maybe it was the desire to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. As the three recruits approached her table, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of revealing who she was immediately, she would let them show their true colors first. Sometimes the best lessons were the ones that came with consequences. The mess hall seemed to grow quieter as the three young men stopped at her table, their shadows falling across her tray. Sarah looked up slowly, her expression neutral but alert, every muscle in her body ready for whatever came next. Jake positioned himself directly in front of Sarah's table, while Danny and Kevin flanked her sides, effectively boxing her in. The classic intimidation formation, though they probably didn't realize they were doing it. Sarah had seen this same positioning used by hostile forces in 3 different countries, and the psychology behind it was always the same. Make the target feel trapped and powerless. "Hey there," Jake said with what he probably thought was a charming smile. "Mind if we join you? Looks like you're sitting all by yourself." Sarah looked up at him calmly, her dark eyes revealing nothing. "Actually, I do mind. I'm trying to eat." Her response seemed to catch Jake off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, come on. Don't be antisocial. We're all Navy here, right? We should stick together." "Speak for yourself," Sarah replied, taking another bite of her pasta. "I don't remember asking for company." Danny leaned closer, invading her personal space. "You know, you've got quite an attitude for someone so." He paused, looking her up and down. Small. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the attention of other diners shifting toward their table. Some sailors had stopped eating entirely, sensing the tension that was building. A few senior petty officers at a nearby table were watching with expressions that suggested they might intervene if things went too far. But Sarah didn't need intervention. She had faced down armed insurgents in Afghanistan and maritime pirates off the coast of Somalia. 3 recruits with attitude problems were hardly a threat, though their behavior was certainly disappointing. "Size is relative," Sarah said evenly, setting down her fork. "In my experience, the people who make the biggest deal about it usually have something to compensate for." Kevin laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Oh, she's got jokes. That's cute. You know what else is cute? Girls who think they're tough just because they put on a uniform. Is that what you think?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "That I'm pretending to be tough?" Jake leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Look, sweetheart. We're not trying to be mean here. But this isn't summer camp. The military is serious business, and maybe you should think about whether you're really cut out for it, before you get yourself hurt," Danny added, with mock concern. Sarah studied their faces carefully. There was arrogance there, yes, but also genuine ignorance. They had no idea who they were talking to, no understanding of what they were dealing with. In a way, she almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "You know what?" Sarah said, pushing back from the table slightly. "You're right. The military is serious business. Maybe you could help me understand what that means. The three recruits exchanged glances, clearly pleased that they seemed to be making progress. Jake straightened up, preparing to deliver what he probably thought would be an educational lecture. Well, for starters, Jake began. It's about physical and mental toughness. Being able to handle extreme situations. Combat, survival, operating under pressure, when people's lives are on the line. Interesting. Sarah nodded. And you three have experience with combat situations? We've been through basic training, Kevin said defensively. We know what we're talking about. Basic training. Sarah repeated thoughtfully. That's impressive. How long ago did you finish? 2 weeks, Danny said proudly. We're here for advanced technical training. Sarah had to bite back a smile. 2 weeks out of basic training, and they thought they were experts on military operations. The confidence of youth was truly something to behold. Advanced technical training, she mused. What field? Electronics maintenance, Jake said. Communications systems. Pretty important stuff. No doubt, Sarah agreed. Communication is vital in military operations, though I imagine it's quite different from field operations. The recruits seemed to sense something in her tone, a subtle shift that they couldn't quite identify. Danny frowned slightly, as if trying to figure out a puzzle. What do you do? Kevin asked, his voice less confident than before. Oh, this and that, Sarah said vaguely. You know how it is in the Navy. Everyone has their role to play. Jake's frustration was becoming visible. Come on, don't be coy. What's your job? Administrative work? Supply? Sarah tilted her head, as if considering the question. You could say I work in problem solving. Problem solving? Danny echoed. Yes. When situations arise that require specialized solutions, I help find ways to resolve them. Sarah's voice remained conversational, but there was something underneath it now, a quality that made the recruits unconsciously step back slightly. The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter around them. Other sailors were no longer even pretending not to watch. Some of the senior enlisted personnel were wearing expressions that ranged from amusement to anticipation, as if they knew something that the recruits didn't. Look, Jake said, clearly growing impatient with the conversation's direction. We're just trying to be friendly here. Maybe show you around the base. Introduce you to some people. You seem like you could use some guidance. Guidance, Sarah repeated slowly. From you three. That's right, Kevin said, his confidence returning. We know our way around. We could help you avoid making mistakes. What kind of mistakes? Well, for instance, Danny said, leaning closer again. Acting like you're something you're not. Trying to play in the big leagues when you should stick to your own level. Sarah stood up slowly, her movement so fluid and controlled that it immediately drew everyone's attention. Despite being shorter than all three recruits, there was something about the way she carried herself that suddenly made the height difference irrelevant. You know, Sarah said, her voice still calm, but carrying a new undertone that made the recruits unconsciously straighten up. You're absolutely right about one thing. People should definitely stick to their own level. She took a step toward Jake, who found himself taking an involuntary step backward. The question is, Sarah continued, how do we determine what someone's level actually is? What do you mean? Jake stammered. Well, you've made certain assumptions about my level based on my appearance. Size, age, gender, that sort of thing. But what if appearances can be deceiving? Danny and Kevin were looking increasingly uncomfortable. The dynamics at the table had shifted in a way they couldn't understand, but they could feel it in the air, like an approaching storm. What if, Sarah said, taking another small step forward, someone who looks like they couldn't handle serious military business actually has more experience with real operations than you three combined? That's impossible, Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah smiled for the first time since they had approached her table, but it wasn't a friendly expression. The moment stretched out, tension building like a coiled spring. Around them, the mess hall had fallen almost completely silent, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for what would happen next. Sarah reached slowly into her pocket, her movement deliberate and measured. The three recruits watched nervously, suddenly aware that something fundamental had changed in the last few minutes. The confident swagger they had carried over to her table had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense that they had made a serious miscalculation. She pulled out her military identification card and held it up so all three could see it clearly. The silence in the mess hall was so complete that the buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, United States Navy SEALs," she said quietly, letting the words sink in. 8 years of active duty, 3 combat deployments, currently assigned to SEAL Team 5. The effect was immediate and devastating. Jake's face went completely white. Danny actually took a physical step backward, bumping into an empty chair. Kevin's mouth fell open, as if his brain had temporarily stopped processing information. Around them, the mess hall erupted in a mixture of suppressed laughter and whispered comments. Several senior petty officers were grinning openly, and one Master Chief actually started a slow clap that was quickly joined by others. But, you're... Jake started, then stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence. "Small? Young? Female?" Sarah supplied helpfully. "Yes, I'm aware. It's actually been quite useful in my line of work. People tend to underestimate threats they don't see coming." Danny found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You're really a SEAL?" "Really," Sarah confirmed. "Would you like to see my trident pin? Or should we discuss those combat situations and extreme circumstances you were educating me about earlier?" The three recruits looked like they wanted nothing more than for the floor to open up and swallow them. Kevin was staring at his feet, while Jake seemed to be having trouble maintaining eye contact with Sarah. "Ma'am, you were just what?" Sarah asked, her tone still calm, but with an edge that cut through the air like a blade. "Making assumptions based on appearance? Trying to intimidate someone you thought was weaker than you? Explaining how the military works to someone who's actually lived it?" Jake finally managed to look up at her. "We screwed up. We're sorry." "Sorry," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. A minute ago, you were concerned about me getting hurt because I wasn't cut out for military life. Now you're apologizing. What changed?" "We found out who you are," Kevin said quietly. "Exactly," Sarah said. "You found out who I am. But here's the thing. I was the same person, before you knew my rank and occupation, as I am now. The only thing that changed was your perception." She looked at each of them in turn, making sure she had their full attention. "Let me ask you something. If I had been exactly who you thought I was, a young sailor, new to the military, maybe working in communications or administration, would your behavior have been acceptable then?" The question hung in the air. None of the recruits seemed to have an answer. "Because here's what I need you to understand," Sarah continued. "Every person in this mess hall, regardless of their rank, their job, their size, or their gender, deserves to be treated with respect. They deserve to eat their dinner in peace, without being harassed by people who think they know better." Danny nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. You're absolutely right." "Am I?" Sarah asked. "Because 2 minutes ago, you were explaining to me how the military worked. Now you're agreeing with everything I say. Which version of you should I believe?" Creases. The question clearly made all three recruits uncomfortable, which was exactly Sarah's intention. She wanted them to think, really think, about what had just happened. And why. "Here's what I think," Sarah said, settling back into her chair, but not inviting them to sit down. "I think you three have learned something important today. But I'm not sure you understand what it is yet." Jake shifted nervously. "Ma'am, the lesson isn't that you shouldn't mess with people because they might turn out to be Navy SEALs," Sarah explained. "The lesson is that you shouldn't mess with people. Period." Because everyone deserves respect, and because you never actually know what someone else has been through or what they're capable of. She picked up her fork and took another bite of pasta, as if the conversation was just a normal dinner discussion. In my line of work, she continued, assumptions get people killed. The person who looks like the least threat might be the most dangerous. The situation that seems simple might be incredibly complex. You learn to keep your mouth shut and your eyes open until you actually understand what you're dealing with. Kevin found his courage enough to ask, "What should we do now, ma'am?" Sarah considered the question. "Well, you could start by going back to your table and thinking about what just happened. Really thinking about it. Ask yourselves why you thought it was appropriate to surround a fellow sailor and lecture them about military life when you've been out of basic training for exactly 2 weeks. Yes, ma'am," all three said in unison. "And in the future," Sarah added, "you might consider that the best way to learn about military life is to listen more and talk less. Every person you meet has something to teach you, if you're smart enough to pay attention." Danny started to turn away, then stopped. "Ma'am? Can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded. "What's it really like? Being a SEAL, I mean. Is it like in the movies?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah's expression softened slightly. "It's nothing like the movies. It's harder and more complicated and less glamorous than you could imagine. But it's also the most rewarding thing I've ever done." "Do you think?" Jake started, then stopped himself. "Do I think what? Do you think someone like me could ever make it through SEAL training?" Sarah looked at him carefully, seeing past the swagger to the genuine question underneath. "I don't know, but I can tell you this. If you can't treat a fellow sailor with respect in a mess hall, you're definitely not ready for the kind of teamwork that special operations requires." Jake nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "The good news," Sarah added, "is that people can learn and grow. The question is whether you want to put in the work to become better than you are right now." She stood up again, gathering her tray. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a briefing to attend. Something about maritime insertion techniques that you probably wouldn't understand." As she walked away, the three recruits remained standing by the empty table, processing what had just happened. Around them, normal conversation gradually resumed in the mess hall. But Sarah could feel their eyes following her until she disappeared through the exit. Later, she would hear from other sailors that the three recruits had spent the rest of the evening sitting quietly at their table, barely speaking to each other. Word of the confrontation would spread through the base within hours, becoming the kind of story that got told to new arrivals as a lesson about respect and assumptions. But for Sarah, it was just another day in the life of someone who had learned long ago that the most important battles weren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they were fought with words, patience, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were capable of. As she walked across the base toward her briefing, Sarah reflected on the encounter. Those three young men would either learn from what happened today, or they wouldn't. She had given them the opportunity and the lesson. What they did with it was up to them. But she had a feeling that none of them would ever again assume they knew everything about someone based on their appearance. And maybe, just maybe, they would remember to treat their fellow sailors with the respect that everyone in uniform deserved. That would be victory enough